Welcome back once again, everyone. Today, we're going to be starting chapter 27, which is called Empire and Expansion. So here, we are going to be focusing almost entirely on foreign policy of the United States in the late 19th century, seeing the United States really moving outward and the beginnings of the United States acquiring overseas territories, becoming interested in overseas territories, and in many cases getting downright aggressive when it came to acquiring overseas territories, or at least, protecting economic interests in overseas territories and that sort of thing. The beginnings of American imperialism, the creation of an American empire, as it were. And this is a very interesting development, and it's a completely different path than we might have expected the United States to end up on, given everything that we talked about, in the 10th grade. We know the United States went from, almost total isolation. Think about George Washington and the whole don't make foreign alliances and neutrality, and we don't get involved in all this kind of stuff. And we started a little bit in the 10th grade kind of chipping away at that with things like the Monroe Doctrine, for example. That, by the way, is going to become very important in this chapter. We're going to see that be kind of built upon, to a point where the United States is wanting to take over other places, has economic and even, military and political interests in other parts of the world. So it takes a while to get there. And it is related to, very much related to, and in many ways is partially a result of the economic growth and expansion, the industrial expansion, all of those factors that we've been talking about these past couple of weeks. That very much does turn or make a lot of people kind of start to look outward to say, if we're going to be we're this powerful industrial nation, then we should also have overseas territories, both for economic reasons, but also beginning to see the United States as, hey, we shouldn't be letting everybody else run the world, that we should be a part of that as well. And we don't want to be left behind by countries like Britain and Spain and France and all of those, who, by the way, have been practicing imperialism for a whole long time. So let's start by just defining what we mean by imperialism. I'm assuming that's probably a term and a concept a lot of you are quite familiar with, but we want to talk about, mention what it is, and then also look at the background to this. Why is America turning outward? Why have so many more people become interested in overseas territories? And why are some people pushing this wrong direction as a policy that the United States needs to be pursuing, rather than something they should be staying away from at all costs, which is, of course, what we saw in most of the 18th and 19th centuries. So when we talk about imperialism, and I have here the new imperialism, because that's probably how people that were supportive of American imperialism at this time would have phrased it, that they were doing imperialism a little differently. We're not like Europeans. We have kind of a different way of doing it and different reasons for doing it. But just imperialism itself is that practice, the policy of acquiring territory, of gaining new territory. You might call it kind of like establishing colonies, of gaining control over other territories, either politically or for economic purposes, or having both of those kinds of control over them, but acquiring overseas territories, extending your reach, extending your rule, establishing colonies or whatever, and creating that empire. Again, that is something that a lot of European countries had been doing for centuries, and you can see why many Americans would have stayed away from that. The United States, having formerly been colonies of an imperial country, would have had a very ugly taste in their mouth about that. But advocates of American imperialism are gaining a lot of ground in the late 19th century. Again, a lot of this a result of the major economic changes and therefore the social changes that were taking place in America in the late 19th century. And a lot of this is economic. And when we talk about the new imperialism, that's what a lot of advocates of the new imperialism probably would have pointed out, as say, we want to acquire overseas territories for economic reasons. This is not so much about flexing military muscle, although that is part of it. but they would argue we're not talking about just going in and taking over so we can be militarily powerful and all of that. This is about economic growth and expansion. This is about making sure that our economy does well, and it's kind of a necessity because of the economic changes that have been taking place in the United States since the Civil War, and the years following the Civil War. Some people were beginning to argue that imperialism was simply necessary, that the United States almost had no choice but to start looking outward. So these first couple of reasons have to do with that. So again, these are some of the factors here that lead to American imperialism and why some people were supportive of it. One was a need for new markets. And when we talk about markets in this place, we don't literally mean we need to build more stores. A market in an economic sense, you're talking about just a place where goods are exchanged, but not like the actual store, the outdoor market, just, anything. Anyway. So they're arguing that because the United States has grown so much industrially, we are now one of the biggest industrial, if not the biggest industrial power in the world, we've got to have new markets in which to sell those manufactured goods because we want this economy to continue growing and expanding. We want it to thrive. So we need to acquire overseas territories so that we can have other places where we can extend that economic reach. It would also be a market for raw materials, that in order to feed that industry that we're trying to keep up, we've got to have access to raw materials and resources that we are quickly exhausting in the United States to get all the different things that we're going to need to make these different manufactured products. So a lot of this, again, you'll notice is economic, that we've got to have places to sell our goods. We've got to have resources to make our goods because we're becoming, the most industrialized, one of the biggest economies on earth. We can't afford not to expand outward. Similar to that is what some people call the safety valve theory. And a safety valve is a mechanism on a lot of different machines, that prevents something from exploding or prevents something bad from happening. So this is that kind of basic same concept just applied to society, I suppose. But this was the idea that there were so much economic growth, but also there were so many problems that had been created by that. There was so much economic tension. There was so much tension between the working class and wealthier Americans, between employers and employees, that there were so much labor disputes, all that kind of stuff, that we needed to move outward. We needed to have that distraction of acquiring new territory and the adventure and the excitement and the patriotism that might inspire, that we needed that to kind of distract us almost from some of these problems that we have, that if we do not expand, we will explode. If we don't have an outlet for all of that tension, that we're going to have serious problems. So that one is kind of economic in nature and kind of, almost escapist kind of a thing, like the idea that imperialism would somehow help us, I don't know if forget is the right word, but maybe just kind of give us something else to think about and maybe give us, something else to, and population growth is part of it too. That this would, because our population is swelling, if we have other places to go and colonize, then maybe we can, alleviate some of the pressures and some of the problems with all of that. So economics is a big part of it. Religion's a part of it as well, and nationalism, that sort of thing. But for some people, felt this was quite a religious command almost, and unfortunately, it goes back to some rather racist. There's not a better word for it. Attitudes at the time. The belief in this Anglo-Saxon superiority, the belief in the superiority of white Christian, Anglo-Saxon descended Protestants. The belief that white Americans were somehow a superior race, and that Americans in general were sort of, ordained by God to go and spread their ideas and spread their values across the world. It's the exact same concept as Manifest Destiny that we talked about in the 10th grade. The belief that that Americans had an obligation to civilize other parts of the world, that other countries, other cultures, needed to be helped. And while there were plenty of people that probably meant well in that, as backward as it sounds, there were people that said, other people should benefit from what we know. We could bring technology, we could bring medical care. We could bring economic development to poor places, to places where they don't have those kinds of things. But there is also very much, a racist attitude to that now. What we would now see as very racist, as, other people are backwards and we need to civilize them and Americanize them and all that sort of thing. But some people, for a lot of folks, this took on a religious tone, that this was kind of God's will. And a lot of people that supported imperialism were ministers and missionaries, and people that, took it upon themselves as missionaries to go and bring Christianity and, try to spread religion, Christian religion, to other parts of the world as well. So that came with people that probably meant well, and it also comes with people that just downright thought Americans were better than everybody else, and therefore we had a right to go around and impose on other people and that sort of thing. So it's like a civilizing mission that they had to be on. Another factor that leads to imperialism, this is kind of a fun one, something called yellow journalism, which some of you may be familiar with. And you should have read about, I didn't talk about it in the notes in the lectures, but in the late 19th century, one of the cultural developments is a lot more people are reading. You have the wide circulation of newspapers, and you hopefully read about kind of the two big newspaper giants of the day, and that was Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. And they are the pioneers of this whole yellow journalism thing. Yellow journalism is like sensational news reporting. It's news stories and a style of news reporting that is designed to get people's attention and get people excited and get people kind of whipped up into a frenzy and sell newspapers. It's all about selling the newspapers, headlines that are just, exciting. But yellow journalism often, or really what makes it yellow journalism, is that it is exaggerated. Some of it is not even true. And Hearst and Pulitzer were both, masters at, making stuff sound like more than it was, or if they didn't have all the facts, just making up stuff, designed to kind of whip people up into a frenzy. It's kind of like, I think the best analogy I can make to today, I used to say like tabloids, but it's not really so much tabloids. I think a better analogy for us might be something like clickbait, It's like something, it sounds really cool or really weird, and then, or the thumbnail of something looks really strange, and then when you watch the video or read the article, it's not like it's an outright lie, but they certainly make something sound a lot cooler or a lot better or a lot more exciting or interesting than it probably really was. That's kind of what yellow journalism does. Well, how that relates to imperialism, these newspapers and Hearst and all of them would write these stories about how imperialism was exciting and exotic places and new ideas and new people, and how this was, manly and masculine and very American and all this sort of stuff. And we'll talk about it again when we actually get to the Spanish-American War. The yellow journalists are the ones that are saying, like, look at all this bad stuff that's happening and making it sound like it's 1,000 times worse than it probably was, and really kind of getting public opinion on their side, and people kind of getting super excited about it because of really quite exaggerated and oftentimes not even true stuff that they're reading in the newspaper. Now, I said this was mostly economic, and then a lot of people are saying this doesn't have to do with military power. It's not about us just going around and, telling everybody what to do. But for some folks, it absolutely was. And certainly there were plenty of people that felt the United States either was powerful or should be, and that we should not just stand by and allow Britain and France and Spain and everybody else to, to run around and take over the whole world, and with us being left behind, that would leave us like in a, second class position. So there were plenty of people that felt that imperialism was important because the United States needed to flex its military power and needed to kind of make itself known as a military power throughout the world. One person that believed in that, and then other people believed in his theory, Alfred Thayer Mahan, who wrote a book about the importance of naval power, the importance of having a strong, powerful Navy and having a naval presence throughout the world. And so he was committed, and he publishes this book which convinces other people that it was very important for, one, the United States to expand its Navy and to invest a lot of money in building more modern warships. This is the beginning of what, at least in my mind, are kind of the more modern looking battleships and that kind of stuff, big battleships and all of those things to support American naval power. And that not only should they build up the fleet, but that fleet ought to have a presence in other parts of the world, that we should have overseas territories so that we can have naval bases in the Pacific and over here and all this kind of stuff to protect our interests. And so it is because of Alfred Thayer Mahan that we will see the United States build up the Navy, and there were several other political leaders, presidents, secretaries of state, and others that agreed with Mahan and felt that imperialism was important to expand military presence, particularly the presence of the United States Navy. A couple of important people when it came to imperialism, some of the early folks that believed that this was very important, that this should be a part of the American agenda, and that worked to see to that. William Seward is one. William Seward was Secretary of State. He was actually Secretary of State under Lincoln. So his work towards imperialism actually goes back that far, although we really won't see the United States starting to really acquire a lot of overseas territories until the 1890s. William Seward was working on that as early as the 1860s and 70s. He was one that believed, he was very much an expansionist, believed that it was extremely important that the United States sort of take its place in the world. And he did a couple of things as Secretary of State to try to influence that. One of the things that does eventually happen, but it was kind of just in the plans and the works for a long time, was about building a canal somewhere through Central America to connect the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean. William Seward secured rights to build such a canal in what's now Nicaragua. That's not where they end up building it, as some of you know, but he did secure those rights, kind of thinking along those lines. Probably the thing that Seward is most known for as far as imperialism is the purchase of Alaska. So it is under his leadership as Secretary of State that the United States purchases Alaska, which had been claimed by Russia and a few other places. And people made fun of this and called it Seward's Folly. So Seward's Folly refers to the purchase of Alaska. Folly meaning like a fail, because people thought, why did you buy this frozen wasteland? It's not good for anything. He bought it for super cheap. But of course, that eventually becomes a state, and people do eventually see it as having strategic importance. But that was one of the first sort of attempts of that era of trying to expand further, after the Civil War, that is. And then there are others, particularly other secretaries of state that further believe that imperialism was important. And in the United States, even if we're not acquiring overseas territories, that we should be more present, that we should have more of a voice, that we should flex more muscle, that we should be a part of that conversation, and we should not be just going, oh, we're neutral, we don't get involved, when other kind of stuff was going on. So we're going to look at how American imperialism started to simmer in both Latin America and all in the Pacific. Because Latin America, of course, means Central and South America. That is going to be, for imperialists, that was kind of the first and really the main target. That was the area that the United States, in a way, had a long time ago kind of claimed as sort of being ours. So that is where a lot of imperialists will look to as the place where the United States needs to expand their influence. And then also we'll look at it in the Pacific in just a moment. So one of the first ways we see the United States, some kind of big moments where we see the United States Again, not so much claiming territory, because imperialism is not just about saying, hey, this territory is ours. In the case of the United States, it oftentimes just means extending economic influence. It just means, we haven't taken over you, but we're in your business kind of stuff. So that's a lot of what we'll look at here. But just as William Seward was a Secretary of State that was a big expansionist and a proponent of expansion and imperialism. The same is true of James G. Blaine. He was a Secretary of State much later on under Cleveland. He's also a big expansionist and believes, again, that the United States needs to be more present, that the United States should, step up, and the United States should not just let everybody else run everything, particularly when it came to Latin America. He believed in that Monroe Doctrine. So this is where that Monroe Doctrine comes back and becomes really important. If you recall, the Monroe Doctrine, 1820, it was in response to, Latin American countries had become independent, and then some European countries had kind of suggested that they weren't going to allow that. And so Monroe had very, very vaguely implied that the United States would not tolerate any kind of intervention in Latin America, and the United States would protect Latin American countries, and the United States would support Latin American independence. Recall, and we read it, if you remember, it did not outright threaten. It didn't say we'll fight you, but it could be interpreted that way, and that's how James G. Blaine is going to interpret it. He's going to interpret it as, we're going to enforce this Monroe Doctrine, and we're going to invoke this Monroe Doctrine if we have to, and we will fight if we have to protect some of our Latin American friends, as it were. So another thing, so we'll look at that in a second, but the Pan American Conference, Pan means like bringing together, like, grouping things together. So this was a conference which he presided over. So the United States was kind of the ringleader in this. He presided over it, and leaders from other Latin American countries came to this conference. And it was about getting the United States involved in the economics of these countries. It was about, let's establish good trading relationships. Let's be on good terms. Let's all be friends. We want to open up trade. We want to have commerce with each other so that you can grow your economy and we can grow our economy. It's all about the United States having access to markets in Latin America and to be able to invest in Latin American countries and build factories and trade and all that kind of stuff. But all in good, for what's for the best of everybody. And that's good and it's bad. It leads to both good and bad things, because it does lead to more cooperation between those, and it does kind of lead to some good relationships and a show of good faith amongst the United States and a lot of Latin American countries. That Pan American Conference, kind of still, that whole organization still kind of is around, but it does also lead in some cases to the United States getting what a lot of Latin American countries would say was too involved in their economies and, meddling in it. But we see that as part of, economic imperialism, is we want to make sure we're trading with you, and it's all about what's in the best interest of everybody. And then where James G. Blaine is going to really assert that Monroe Doctrine and say, hey, we will fight if we have to in order to protect these countries. There was an incident between a British territory and Venezuela, British Guiana and Venezuela, which are both in South America. There had been a border dispute for a long, long, long time about this, and the dispute itself is not what's important. It's not so much important that you know why these two countries or territories were fighting with each other. It has to do with the United States' reaction to it, because Britain was getting involved. So there's a European country that's involved in this border dispute. And in this case, the United States, with James G. Blaine as the Secretary of State, basically kind of sent the message to Britain of, y'all need to work this out, and there should not be any fighting about it. Y'all need to, settle this dispute and give Venezuela what they want and all that kind of stuff. And Britain sort of said, are you joking? You don't get to tell us what to do. And they sort of, ignored it at first. And then he was very adamant that if you don't, we will fight. Like, they threatened to go to war with Britain over this. again, invoking that Monroe Doctrine to say, we're going to step in and protect Latin American countries. We're not going to let you come over here and start a fight. We will fight you if that is the case. And that actually eventually caused Britain to back down, not just because of that, but they weren't interested in a war with the United States. This is happening when a lot of ugly stuff is starting to brew in Europe, and so Britain didn't want to fight the United States over this, so they backed down. And it eventually leads to peace. It eventually works things out, but here was a situation where the United States did outright threaten conflict, and a very powerful nation like Britain seemed to acquiesce to what the United States wanted. So it was definitely a flex of a whole lot more muscle than you would have seen the United States show in the past, and an invoking of that Monroe Doctrine, which we're going to continue to see further and further. It also leads actually to much better cooperation between Britain and the United States. It's one of the last times that Britain and the United States kind of get into it a little bit. And from that point on, Britain really starts to see far more value in working with the United States and being sort of allied with the United States than anything else. So it's that relationship had been better for a long time, but it is certainly some people would even argue that after that, Britain is much more conciliatory toward the United States than they had ever been. So things are going to continue. And there's that light. Can't have a day without that happening. Things will continue to heat up in Latin America. We'll continue to talk about that, particularly after the Spanish-American War. Next, we want to look at American interests in the Pacific and American interest in Hawaii, because this is one of the first Pacific territories that the United States is going to acquire. American interest in Hawaii, which of course is islands in the Pacific Ocean, first peaked because of sugar. Hawaii was a place where sugar was grown and sugar plantations and all that kind of stuff. So that is the first reason why some Americans became interested in Hawaii. And there were a lot of white Americans in Hawaii as sugar planters. And they made lots of money. There were lots of people invested in all of that. And that kind of gets the United States first involved in it, although Hawaii was an independent, they were their own country. But with the growth of American interests in Hawaii and more sugar producers who were quite wealthy, even though this was not an American territory, a lot of Americans kind of treated it like it was and sort of assumed that it sort of was, much to the dismay of Native Hawaiians. They even eventually got a treaty with Hawaii in the 1880s, which is where the United States got access to Pearl Harbor. And that economic, having an economic hand in Hawaii continues to grow and grow. As that happens, more American influence over the Hawaiian Islands. The population, the Native Hawaiian population, was in decline because of disease and being overworked as laborers on these plantations and that sort of thing. And then in the 1890s, with industrialization, you get tariffs risen really, really high. That was something that those industrialists wanted, tariffs, taxes on imports. Well, that really started to upset these sugar planters in Hawaii, because high tariffs means that there's high tariffs on their sugar, because Hawaii is a foreign territory, and so that means it's an import. They would have tariffs slapped on their sugar. And so those planters start to think, well, how do we get rid of those tariffs? Become part of the United States, become a United States territory, and then it's no longer foreign, it's no longer an import, and we don't have to pay tariffs. Well, of course, the Hawaiian government and the Hawaiian people didn't want that. So what do the white planters, mostly, American planters, decide to do? They stage a revolt against the Hawaiian government, specifically against the Hawaiian queen, who is pictured right there. That is Queen Liliuokalani, who was the, like I said, queen of Hawaii, and they stirred up and kind of provoked and almost even kind of fabricated this revolt against her to overthrow her so that they could then, whip up this treaty for annexation. So they organized this revolt against her, overthrow the queen, and hastily throw together a treaty for annexation and present this to Congress to say we want to annex Hawaii into the United States, not as a state, but as territory. But actually, that annexation, this is like 1892, I think, that annexation was rejected by Congress. Actually, it was rejected by the president. President Cleveland at the time said no, because when they looked into it, further investigation, suggested that revolt was not in the interest or was not something that the majority of Hawaiians wanted, that thing had been, egged on by white planners. This whole thing had been manipulated and it was not done right, if you can do a revolt correctly. And so it was actually rejected at that particular time. The Queen was never reinstated, and that the planners continue to have a lot of control over Hawaii. And it won't be too long before Hawaii will be annexed. It will be annexed officially in 1898. I think I put that in here. Yeah, officially in 1898 as part of the Spanish-American War. They'll go ahead and seal the deal, but for a while it's just kind of still somewhere in between. So here we see an example of not just the United States attempting to acquire an overseas territory, but attempting to acquire an overseas territory in what some might consider a rather kind of nefarious way, which is not uncommon through some of this kind of stuff. So we're seeing the United States beginning to expand outward, beginning to see overseas territory as a necessity as opposed to something the United States needed to avoid. And in the next section, we will look at kind of the big event that really turns the United States into an imperial power with multiple overseas territories, some of which the United States still has, some of which we don't, and that will be the Spanish-American War. So we will look at that next time.